everybody, I'm Anvesha. Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, then welcome to my channel Psyche Bubbles. I'm a counseling psychologist and I love talking about everything related to psychology. The reason I wanted to talk a little bit about anxiety and anxiety disorders, but mostly also about avoidance as a coping strategy, because this is one of the most common experience all of us has gone through, even those of us who do not have a diagnosed anxiety disorder. Anxiety can be a natural response to a lot of things that is stressful or makes us feel uncomfortable. With that being said though, the experiences we have when we are anxious about something that warrants that sort of emotion versus when we have anxiety disorder can be very different in terms of intensity for how long we experience these emotions or thoughts and how severely it affects our day-to-day life. To begin with, let's try to understand what is anxiety. It is basically an anticipatory response when we are face to face with something uncomfortable that might happen in the future. Let me explain that with an example. Let's say we have an exam tomorrow on a subject that's actually difficult and we don't really like it, and so we have not really been confident about it. The day prior, many of us may experience tightness in our chest, we might experience clammy hands, we might feel dizzy, we might lose our appetite, or our heart may be beating really fast. Now, what is happening here is an anxious response to something that will happen in the future, which is the exams. A lot of us may be constantly worried about not doing well in the exam, or we might find it difficult to even prepare for the exam. Some of us might have all these worrying thoughts about failing the exams. We might find it really difficult to prepare for it. Now, these are also very natural things to experience. Most of us, though, will overcome it after the exam is done. In fact, if there are any more exams left, in case those are not as difficult, we won't really feel that anxious as such. That's where a natural anxious response is different from an anxiety disorder. But we all experience that. With that being said though, if you feel like you get anxious about a lot of things, or you constantly worry about not doing well or not really doing your best in anything, it might still help to maybe talk to a friend or a psychologist and just process those thoughts a little, maybe learn a few coping skills. They might really help to manage any future experiences. On the other hand, anxiety disorders are much more intense. In fact, the responses that we might have emotionally or even cognitively will be very much different from the actual situation. A lot of us may experience physical symptoms so intense, like in the case of panic attacks, that it can feel like we are getting a heart attack. So it is extremely important to look at the situation with kindness and empathy. Anxiety disorders are one of the most common health concerns that people are diagnosed with. For us to be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, we have to experience the symptoms like clammy hands or tightness in chest. For some people, they feel really dizzy. For some people, it can actually feel like they're getting, as we said, a heart attack. So these symptoms might need to be experienced for 6 months, and for a lot of times it has to not really be dependent on the situation. Many people who have panic attacks don't really have these experiences because something is happening in their life. Many of them might be even laughing with their friends and they could feel a panic attack coming in. Also, for a lot of them, anxiety disorders can be very crippling. It makes a lot of us not be able to do our day-to-day works smoothly. So can you imagine how frustrating that is? So if you know someone who is experiencing anxiety disorders or who might show signs of having anxiety disorders, please let them know that help is out there. They can reach out to psychologists or psychiatrists and talk in depth about what they're going through and maybe come up with a treatment plan or proper diagnosis which can help them out a lot, because we all deserve to get that help. But we also have to acknowledge that a lot of times we can dismiss someone with an anxiety disorder. But because a lot of us have experienced anxiety in some capacity, even if it's not as a disorder, it can become easy for some of us to dismiss others with an anxiety disorder. We might think things like, why aren't they getting over it soon? Why can't they manage their emotions better? Why can't they stop being anxious? But the thing is, someone with anxiety disorder can find it very difficult to manage their worry. A lot of times, these worrying thoughts can spiral, which is why the expectation that people with anxiety disorders or any severe experiences of anxiety need to get over it as soon as possible is also not fair. Therapy can be very helpful when it comes to dealing with anxiety. Sometimes particular medications can also help manage the symptoms. It's completely okay to choose a method of treatment or managing the symptoms that will work for us in the long term. So, for some of us, it might be medications, for others, it can be simply therapy. An important thing to remember though is that when we are anxious, whether we have an anxiety disorder or not, we can experience a lot of symptoms that seem very similar to when we are scared about something. Now, let's say we have a job where our employer or our boss is very toxic. The work environment itself is also very toxic. Every day when we wake up, we feel something in our stomach drop, or we feel like we might vomit, or we might have to go to the bathroom, or we feel very sweaty, our hands feel very clammy, we feel like we are trembling or feverish. That can be a direct response to the kind of work environment we have to go back to every single day. In fact, there have been times where I've had conversations with people where they said that the moment they changed their jobs and went to a place that was more welcoming, where they could talk to their coworkers freely, they immediately stopped feeling those sensations every single day. Another situation could be that, the workplace that they go to, it's really nice. The co-workers are really nice. Their boss is very understanding. But they already have been diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, right? There may be days where they wake up and they're just getting ready and all of a sudden they feel those exact same sensations. But they don't really know why. Thing is, our brain finds it very difficult to differentiate between when we are scared about something that's happening to us or we are just anxious or worried about something that might happen. So it feels equally as intense. So it's not that we are being silly or even stupid. In fact, that is one of the things people are labeled with when they start feeling anxious, even if the situation they're facing is not as intense, which is actually very sad. But that's the thing, right? It's so physically uncomfortable to feel anxious that it's extremely natural for us to want to avoid that discomfort. Before we talk about avoidance as a strategy, it is extremely important to take note that any coping strategy we use, it's mostly based in wanting to survive through discomfort, pain, a lot of hardships, whether it's hardships in our physical reality or emotional hardships with going through day-to-day life. So we are not going to shame ourselves or anyone else who uses avoidance as a strategy. We will be empathetic and will try to be curious as to why it is used so often. Avoidance is actually a pretty common strategy used by a lot of us, whether we have an anxiety disorder or not. And it basically involves us either physically or emotionally distancing ourselves from something that makes us uncomfortable. So the best example, if we had to use the same example of exams, so let's say if I stopped preparing for the exams and started reading a book, which I have done in the past, that will be a form of avoidance. Let's say that I need to have a difficult conversation with someone and I feel really anxious. So I put off that conversation for a later date. That also will be an avoidance. Let's say I feel really sad about something and I don't really want to think about it or feel it. So I start distracting myself. Maybe I'm doing some chores or I'm watching something funny. That is also a form of avoidance. Now, avoidance strategies are not always bad. because maybe we are not in the position to address something just yet. If we started letting ourselves feel that sadness just yet, we fear that we might not be able to do anything else. So sometimes avoidance strategies make sense because we want to keep going, we want to keep moving forward. But avoidance strategies can cause a lot of problems in the long run. Now, specifically when it comes to being anxious or having an anxiety disorder, majority of the people start to not just avoid the uncomfortable situations, but also the good things that come with it. I'll use another examples because it's really easy to explain with examples. So I love coffee. So let's say I have a coffee shop that's opened maybe a few months back near my neighborhood, and I do visit that place often. A lot of times I find it really calming, the place is very nice and quiet, the music is really nice and all of that. But I may have had a few instances where I did something embarrassing or it was very stressful for me to order coffee. And not only that, I start noticing that next time whenever I go to order a coffee, I start feeling uncomfortable, like I start feeling my chest beating really fast. And I don't want to feel that way. So what do? I stop visiting that coffee shop entirely. But another thing happens. I've also stopped visiting the place that I actually liked spending time in. I like that environment, but I've stopped going there now. And that is something that happens a lot of times when we are avoiding uncomfortable situation. You might have noticed another thing. People who are anxious and use a lot of avoidance strategies, we end up feeling a lot more anxious in similar situations later. That could be because in our minds, that previous incident that made us uncomfortable, it becomes more and more intense. Or it can also be that we are not really habituated. We are not really desensitized or used to facing similar situations. Another reason could be a lot of times we are not really equipped with handling conversations that make us uncomfortable, or we are not really equipped with strategies to manage our emotions. And sometimes avoidance strategies can make that worse because we don't really get to practice these skills in real life situations. Now, we are not saying that avoidance is bad in and of itself. But when we overuse that strategy for every situation, we don't really allow ourselves to be flexible when it comes to managing our emotions, and we use the same strategy again and again in different situations. I'll be making another video talking a lot more about coping skills and different types of coping strategies. But for the sake of this video, let us use the example of an MCQ question and MSQ question when it comes to coping. Now, for those of us who are not familiar with what these questions are, an MCQ question is where a question is given and there are multiple options, maybe 4 to 5 of them, and we have to choose one option that is correct. With MSQ questions, there is a question provided to us, and again there are 4 to 5 options, but this time we can choose more than one option to answer that question correctly. Many times when we are feeling anxious, we can believe that we have only one or the other strategy that we can use. For example, people who use a lot of avoidance strategies may do so and think that there's no other way out of managing the situation. The only other option that they have, other than avoiding, is to suffer through an uncomfortable situation. When we look at it through an MSQ approach, we need to take a step back and see that when we are avoiding something or somebody that makes us uncomfortable, we are also avoiding people or maybe places that make us feel happy. Using the same example of the coffee shop, let's say I know that going there is not what makes me anxious, but talking to the employees there and maybe ordering something is what makes me uncomfortable. So I can try something called emotional coping style, and maybe I go with a support system, a friend or a family to that shop who will be there with me when I order, so it feels less uncomfortable for me. For some other people, they like to prepare their order, so they may write it down in a little sheet of paper or practice in front of the mirror. Some people may think that those around us would make fun of us for maybe taking a friend or a family member to a coffee shop just to buy coffee, or to practice in front of the mirror before ordering at a public place. But the thing is, we are trying to do the best we can. While it is true that maybe someone would make fun of us for using these strategies, but at the end of the day, if it is helping us and is not causing anybody any harm, then what's the worst that could happen? Best case scenario is we won't feel as anxious or ill prepared in situations like these. It is important to remember that when we are using coping mechanisms, even when we are trying to avoid the situation through maybe procrastination or substance abuse, we are trying to survive that hardship or the difficult time. So we are just trying to increase the options of coping mechanisms that we have at our disposal so that we can use them. So if it is breathing techniques, grounding techniques, or support systems, people we can talk to, or just practicing skills like, as we said, ordering coffee and practicing it in front of the mirror before we do that. These are just ways we can handle unpleasant situations instead of only using one or two coping mechanisms that we used to earlier. To summarize, it is important to take a step back and notice if we are only avoiding anxiety-inducing places or people, or are we doing the same for places and people who make us feel happy and comfortable? Because avoiding even the good things makes the situation worse for us. Because when we start isolating ourselves from the people or places that make us happy, it can make us feel more depressed, and in turn it just makes the situation even more unpleasant. Another important thing when it comes to managing these anxious thoughts or emotions is that avoidance can make the situation worse in the long run. So we basically increase the options of skills, or let's say coping strategies, that we have to manage a situation. For today, I'll be adding a few links talking about coping mechanisms and a little bit about anxiety and avoidance so that you can read through them if you want to. For today, that is all. I hope you liked the video. If you did, then feel free to like, share and subscribe to the channel. Also, feel free to leave any comments about your experiences as well, if you feel comfortable. That's all. Bye.